Hey everyone, this is Mario again, coming at you with the first part of my Tolkeinthon. As you all know, I'm going to be covering the 3 animated movies, you know, The Hobbit and The Return of the King, that were done by... Yeah, I'm glancing at my covers because I forget who they were done by off the top of my head, but they were from the 70s and 80s, and then of course the Lord of the Rings animated film done by Ralph Bakshi, or Bakshi, however you pronounce his name. Then of course the trilogy done about 10 years ago by Peter Jackson, and then of course I'm going to review the first part of the Hobbit movies that he's doing. Now of course, to start with any adaptation, you have to start with the source material, and yes, this is my copy of The Hobbit, and this is my copy of The Lord of the Rings. Now, as you can tell, this is the movie tie-in version, but it's the complete thing. Because contrary to what some people believe, Lord of the Rings is technically one book. It was published separate in 3 parts, which I'll get to why when I get to it in here. Now, before I talk about the works themselves, I think I should probably go into my history of them. Now, this is going to talk a little bit about me. Now, when I was in elementary school, for the most part, I was an average student up until about 4th grade. Because I would do the work just to be able to pass, because I wasn't interested in work. I just want, you know, I gotta get through school. But everyone's kind of like that, except for the people that are basically prodigies. Well, I got held back in 4th grade. I know it was partially because I don't want to work, and I don't like doing this crap and stuff like that. But there was some stuff before then I could tell that this might be where I'm heading for. And before 4th grade, there were some little hints that reading and literature might be my thing, but it was only like little tidbits, like certain books that we had to read. Like, I can't think of any from 2nd grade or 1st grade. Only one before that I remember is Frog and Toad Are Friends. In 3rd grade, we read The Wizard of Oz, which that was probably my first thing that maybe I might get into literature. And of course, we also watched the movie, and then of course I talked the teacher into watching Return to Oz, but that's a different day, a different video. Now, 4th grade, both times we read the same books, and so read them twice and really enjoyed them, like By the Great Horn Spoon being one of them. And I started thinking, you know, maybe this might be something. Maybe I'm probably more thought this subconsciously than, you know, like how I'm articulating it now. But it was the next year that I even started thinking more maybe writing might be it. Because the next year, in my 5th grade class, the first book we had to read, it was the book we had to read because it's part of the curriculum, I don't know if it still is, was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first part of the Chronicles of Narnia series. And then independently, our teacher read us the rest of them. And then once he finished with the Chronicles of Narnia series, the book that he read to us next, because he always used to read to us, like a little bit to us after lunch before we got into afternoon work, the book that he read afterwards was The Hobbit. Now before then, it was basically a reintroduction to The Hobbit for me, because before then I had seen the animated film years before, but it had been years since I'd seen it, and I slowly began to piece, wait a minute, I know this story, as he was reading the book. And then afterwards we watched the animated movie, I'm like, yeah, and I liked it. And then the next thing he started to read was the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, but he only got like not even that far into it. Sorry, brief interruption, but as I was saying, he only got like not even that far into it. But it made me curious to want to go look for the other ones. Around this time I was already starting, you know, jot down stuff, and one of the things that I was jotting down would become the genesis for one of the stories I'm currently in the process of developing even further, but that was the genesis over 10 years ago, so it stuck with me. It was basically just about magical swords and stuff, but that was the genesis of it. Then the next year I read The Hobbit independently, and I loved it even more. So I tracked down The Lord of the Rings. This is a different copy because the copies that I got then were ruined by water, but I tracked them down and started to read them, and I read the first one probably a little bit after the first movie of the live action ones came out, and then I read the 2nd book and the 3rd book before I saw the 2nd and 3rd movies. So I basically knew what the plots were going to be, but I didn't know what to notice the differences. And I enjoyed the books, and just like I enjoyed the movies, which you guys could already probably guess. Now, into it. Now, before I talk about The Hobbit, I probably need to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien a little bit to kind of set the stage for it. As you know, the late Tolkien was born in January of 1892, and he died in September of 1973, so he's a writer that's greatly missed. If you're wondering why I'm pausing, the computer's taking its sweet time loading. Here's something. Here's a little interesting tidbit about him, why it's loading. He was appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II the year before he died. But anyway, he was in World War I. I'm looking to see what rank he was. Apparently he started as a second lieutenant. And I know that some of what he saw during the war, and then eventually what his son saw during the Second World War, is some of the stuff that formed some of the basis for how he wrote war in Lord of the Rings and stuff. So you could tell it's a guy that really had seen the hell of war. And apparently he really did love Beowulf. You know that story. And he even did a lecture in '36 called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, which has had a lasting influence on Beowulf research, because what he did not like was that people were just dismissing the fantasy elements in Beowulf, or at least critics back then were, and just concentrating on the non-fantasy elements just to, you know, try to research into what the time period would have been like, which Tolkien think that does a disservice to the story, and they're trying to get something historical out of something that is supposed to be fantasy. Now, with something like the Bible, you can argue that you could get some historical stuff out of it, because, you know, stuff like that was written as supposed to be a history and something else. But with Beowulf, I agree with Tolkien on it. You could get like maybe you get some understanding of what the time period would have been like, but Beowulf had been carried so long as an oral story before it was written down that it kind of is hard to do that accurately, unless you went back in time and discovered the first one, but it'd be too much. Now, he was also a professor, which I'm trying to see what exactly he taught in. I knew he was English, but an English professor. I'm trying to see what exactly he taught. Those are plaques. Excuse me. Oh, the one on here, I know it says that he was at Merton College in Oxford, where he's the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature. So basically, he was a professor of literature. So when it comes to writing, he basically knew a thing or two about the language. So you can tell that the writing is going to be good, which I get to more when I get to this. Now, with the Hobbit, the idea just basically came to him one day. You know, at least the genes of the story, because the story goes that he was sitting in his office doing some work, where the first line of the novel came to him, and he wrote it down on a blank piece of paper, which was, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And then he just slowly developed the story from there, showed it to a couple people, and they're like, yeah, you should get this published. And eventually he did get it published. And the story, while it is written that anybody can get into it, it basically is a children's story that will appeal to children, or as some people put it, to the child in us. So it's basically for the young and the young at heart. And it does have a kind of a slight humor to it, but it's more like the type of humor that, you know, light-hearted humor, not like, you know, slip on a banana peel humor. But it's one thing that is more, this one has more of a light-hearted feel than this one, I will say, because this one is a little bit more serious, because it's more life and death. But you all know, I think everyone knows the basic story of the Hobbit. You know, Bilbo Baggins is a Hobbit. He's a respectable, conservative Hobbit. And just like all the people with his last name Baggins, they never have any adventures or do anything unexpected. One day he meets the wizard Gandalf, who was an old friend of his grandfather, and Gandalf recruits him to go on a journey with these 13 dwarves to recover a treasure that was stolen from them by a dragon. And of course he's basically reluctant at first, but along the way he basically it's a coming of age story in a way, which is kind of, this is a little late for a coming of age story, because usually coming of age stories usually happen with teenagers or adolescents, whereas Bilbo Baggins is in his 50s. Then again, he's a long-lived race compared to humans anyway. Humans usually live what 60 to 80 years, while hobbits usually could live to be about 110 easily. So a little bit long-lived, not like elves where that would be like you're a child. But I think you get the point. It's a coming of age in the fact that he matures a little bit mentally, and he's not the same as he was before. So it also follows the hero's journey aspect. And the one thing I like about The Hobbit, and by extension Lord of the Rings, is that in most heroes' journeys, either the hero becomes super uber powerful, like Dragon Ball, Naruto, One Piece, or even like the ancient Greek mythologies, like, you know, Hercules and all them, where they have something that gives them an advantage, like superhuman strength. And even Star Wars, the hero has something that gives them an advantage over other people, you know, the Force. But here, physically themselves, they don't have anything. I mean, Bilbo does get the sword sting and then the one ring, but does it really give him that much of a physical advantage? No, he just has to use what he was born with, his wit and what he learns. So that's why I like it, because of that. And also the fact that it's more about kind of him being an underdog, because at the end, when he finally gets to Smaug, it's just him and the worm. Granted, he's invisible, so the dragon can't see him, but still, as they always put in the back, that it's up to Bilbo, alone and unaided, to confront the terror of an entire countryside. Because think of it, Smaug has a whole reputation. No, not even the most toughest of adventurers would go in there alone to face him. And yet the most smallest of persons goes in there alone and does it. Even without the ring, Bilbo probably would have gone through there. He probably wouldn't have lasted as long, but he probably would have still gone in there. And as they put in the animated one, to go those steps, that would be the bravest thing you can ever do. And that's one thing about it. And I do like that it talks about greed. Granted, the whole premise is them going to recover their treasure, so it's kind of warranted. The dragon's greed, but even when they eventually get the treasure back, greed shows through with the Arkenstone. You know, Thorn, like, where's the Arkenstone? He basically does not. He has all this other treasure in there, but just for the one Arkenstone, he'll start a war. So it just shows the love of money is the root of all evil. And it goes even further. I mean, the humans want the treasure, the Wood Elves want the treasure, the Goblins want the treasure. So, see, root of money, greed, root of all evil. And of course, and very interesting novel. If you have not read this novel and you are a fantasy fan, I say give it a read. Excuse me, I almost said watch. You can give it a watch soon, but I say give the book a read because it's a very interesting read. And then one last thing is it is an episodic. Because I'm not going to give away all the chapter titles here, but each of these chapters I'm about to give away, it always centers on just one part of the story. Unexpected party at the beginning. You know, the whole thing about them deciding where they're going to go. Roast mutton, confronting the trolls. A short rest, meeting Elrond at Rivendell. Over hill and under hill, the whole confrontation with the goblins. Riddles in the dark. The riddle contest between Bilbo and Gollum, and how Bilbo finds the one ring, you know. Or should I say, finds the one. Wins the one ring, excuse me. Which leads into another thing I need to talk about, is the fact that this novel was revived when Lord of the Rings came out. Which I will get to after I talk about Lord of the Rings. Now moving on to Lord of the Rings. I know, kind of redundant that I said when I talk about Lord of the Rings. Now moving on to Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit was so popular when it was published in 1937, if I remember right, that the publishers wanted Tolkien to write a sequel, and he spent years writing a sequel. I mean, Lord of the Rings wasn't published until 1954, so that's like a good 10 years or something. And Tolkien was a perfectionist, which is one reason the Similarian and work I'll get to in a little bit was not published until after he died, and even then he hadn't finished it. But anyway, he kept writing different drafts and stuff. I mean, like one of them, Strider, wasn't Aragorn, like he wasn't a final product. He was a hobbit that wore wooden shoes that apparently was tortured in Mordor. But he went through many of them, and because of this, he felt that the Hobbit needed a revision, because in the original edition of the Hobbit, during the riddle contest, Gollum willingly bet the one ring on the riddle contest, and because of this, and because of the nature of the ring changing in the novel, he decided to go and revise it, and we get the current form where instead of Gollum betting it, losing, and then them parting amicably, it was the whole thing we got now. And I like that, because it creates a kind of a little joke thing. The first edition, oh, that's what Bilbo said happened. Second edition, beyond, this is what actually happened. I like that literary device. And now before, I forgot to mention this, should have mentioned this first probably. Now, when he was first writing originally, he was going to do a story about Bilbo running out of money and then having to go get more money, more treasure or something. he decided to go with the story of the One Ring. Now, of course, apparently the idea for the first chapter, A Long Expected Party, came right away, but then after that, he had to slowly develop it. Like I mentioned, the whole thing about the treasure and getting more, but that probably wouldn't have been as exciting as the whole thing with the One Ring, and I'm glad he finally decided to go that direction. Now, another reason it took long for him to write, besides the fact Tolkien was a perfectionist, was of course his job, you know, being a professor. And of course, I mean, for 1 year he totally stopped writing it and then picked it up the next year because his son, to send stuff for his son to read out in the front. Now, once it was done, it became a hassle to publish because the dispute with his publisher. He went to another one. Another party wanted the Similarian to be published alongside it, but they didn't want him to. And then, of course, Collins, the second publisher, said that the book urgently wanted cutting, which I disagree with, because I feel, this is just me, but I feel taking any part of this book out kind of destroys it a little bit. Takes away a little bit of it. Granted, there are parts where where Tolkien goes into great detail about stuff, like setting up the wall. Now, when people say the movies are about walking, that is kind of, but the books have more stuff like that. But it's detail that you don't care if it's there, because it's great detail, like how he describes Minas Tirith, setting up, going into great detail about it. It's like, it makes you really feel like you're looking at the city. That's how great the detail is, and I just love the detail there. It just, I wouldn't it's detail. Some of it you probably wouldn't miss it. You probably wouldn't notice if it was gone, but it's detail that you just like, that he went into. Now, eventually, of course, they decided to publish it in the 3 parts we got: The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. Part of this was because of post-war paper shortages. Another part was to keep the book price down. Combination of the two. And of course, the thing with printing of pages, the books were published later than intended. And Tolkien apparently did not even like the fact that the 3rd volume was called Return of the King. He wanted it to be called War of the Ring, because Return of the King does kind of give away some of the plot. But I don't mind the title. Well, that's just me. Now, Tolkien apparently did not get paid until after the books broke even, which I could see why they would do that. Like, it's like, why pay them and then not break even? Imagine if they did that with certain movie directors. That would be cool. It's like, Samuel Bayer, you're not getting paid until this movie breaks even. Where's my money? We barely broke even, so you're not getting paid. Ah ha ha. That would have been funny. And, now, unlike The Hobbit, which is basically universally praised, The Lord of the Rings, the book, usually mixed, some ranging from excellent, which is where I would be, to the people that, you know, view it as terrible. Like, one person around the time it was published that was a friend of his, Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R.'s son, laid on the couch and was lolling and shouting as he was reading, like, "Oh God, not another elf!" and stuff like that. And some of them were, and even some of the people who gave a negative thought that Tolkien spent, not the detail was probably part of it, but they felt his writing style probably too overly complicated, which I will give him that. It does seem like it. When you compare it to this, it does seem it, but I'm more attributed to the fact that this one is more light-hearted. It seems to be more aimed directly at children. The prose seems to be more straightforward, while this one seems to be more for like teens and up. And also the detail and stuff, and also the fact it's a more serious work, that it kind of, that's probably why it's echoing that. Because if you're aiming for a higher audience, you're not going to want to speak down to them. Like, if you're aiming for an audience that anyone can enjoy, children or up, then you'll probably do that. Like look at children's movies. Even good children's movies will aim that anyone can enjoy, but you can tell it's aimed usually at children. Whereas a bad one, children will enjoy, and adults will be like, "Why am I watching this?" Whereas with The Hobbit is the good children's one, whereas this one is for a higher up audience. At least that's what I get out of it. And I have to agree with C.S. Lewis's review. C.S. Lewis, you know, Chronicles of Narnia. Here's what he wrote. "Here are beauties which pierce like swords or burn like cold iron. Here is a book which will break your heart." I have to agree with that. I know it sounds like a negative review at the end, but it's a positive review, apparently. And of course, there's, other than the animated movies and the live action movies, there's been play adaptations, and radio adaptations of Lord of the Rings, and it's been one of the biggest influences on high fantasy in the last century. I mean, it's influenced things from Dungeons and Dragons to EverQuest, World of Warcraft, and even other fantasy novels. I mean, like, for example, I've been inspired by it. Christopher Paolini, the writer of The Inheritance Cycle, was expired by it. Yeah, he was expired by it. It killed him. He was inspired by it. I mean, and I believe even J.K. Rowling, the writer of Harry Potter, was inspired by it, which that's another thing that inspired me, which I'll get to that another day. It's even inspired music. Like, apparently, I don't know if this is true, but apparently the song Stairway to Heaven is written about the character of Galadriel, which I could see that after listening to the lyrics. Now, after this, there is one other major work in the Tolkien thing. I mean, there's other works like The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, The Unfinished Tales, Children of Húrin, but the last major work is the Similarian, where this one has a more drastic tone. Whereas this one is aimed at children, but anyone can enjoy it. This one aimed for a slightly more mature audience. Still has some of that humor about it, but not. The Similarian, even though I have not read the entire thing, it usually is meant, it has a far more serious tone. And that's one of the reasons why it, too, I believe, has gotten mixed reviews. At the time it came out, it was negative. Here's what it was criticized for. At the time it came out, the Similarian was criticized for being too serious, lacking the light-hearted moments that were found in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And that, here's what Time said about it, that no single unifying quest, and above all, no band of brothers for the reader to identify with. That I will give him, but the main reason that I think this is an important part of the Tolkien thing is that this basically sets up the whole world. Now, this one shows you a little bit of Middle-earth. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Stupid phone, as I was saying. Shows you a little bit more. Shows you more and expands a little bit on the backstory of Middle-earth. The Similarian is basically the whole history of Middle-earth, from the beginning till right before Lord of the Rings. And it's broken up into 4 parts. Now, excuse me for the pronunciation to this, because these are weird pronunciations. We have the first section, which, you know what? I'm just gonna say their translation names. The first part is called the Music of the Ainur, which is basically the the creation of the world. And it's an interesting creation myth, and it's mostly taken from apparently Norse mythology, which I'm not that familiar with, but it's interesting. Now, it talks about the creation of Uru, or the One, also called the Father of All. Sorry about that. And how he creates the Ainur, a group of spirits called the offspring of his thoughts. And one of these is Melkor, who eventually becomes Morgoth, the first dark evil. So basically, the Ainur are basically archangel beings, because there's a secondary one called the Maiar, which includes Sauron, the Balrogs, and even the wizards. So that's right, the wizards aren't human, or mortals. Now, after there's a second part in this called, I'm looking for the title right here, The Account of the Valar, which describes Melkor and the other Ainur in detail, as well as Sauron and some of the other people, and how Melkor basically seduced some of them, including Sauron, to his service. So basically setting up his fall, which I've only read heads up, I've only read a little bit of the Similarian, which is why I could talk about how I know it's written a little bit like that. So I can see why it is, and I actually do want to get a better copy of it, which is the reason I stopped reading it. Because my copy of it was a small paperback that was basically old and felt like it was going to fall apart. Now, the third part of it is basically where the title, the Similarian, comes from. It's called Quenta Similarian, which translates to the history of the Similaris, which is the bulk of the book. And it's a series of interconnected tales set in the first age of Middle-earth that makes up the tragic saga of the 3 jewels, the Similars. And it talks about all, you know, adventures of men, elves, and stuff, and battles against Melkor and stuff. And I think this is also where Melkor officially becomes Morgoth. But don't quote me on that. And the next one is called The Downfallen, which is not that long, and it talks about the rise and fall of the island kingdom of Numenor, which is loosely important in Lord of the Rings. The reason it's loosely important is because one of the descendants of that kingdom is Aragorn, along with the other Dunedain. They're the last people that are left from there. Now, this I do know a little bit. Numenor was a great kingdom, apparently, and after the defeat of Morgoth, Sauron eventually went there and corrupted it, and the island basically fell into the sea. So basically, Numenor is the Lord of the Rings version of Atlantis. And this Lord of the Rings is supposed to be a fictional past of ours. Numenor is supposed to be Atlantis. And then the last one is called Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which is basically a setup to Lord of the Rings, you know, going into more detail about how Sauron helped the elves under his guise as the giver of gifts make the rings, how he made the One Ring, more into detail about the war and stuff. And it's an interesting thing. And if there's any part that any Lord of the Rings fan should read, it's probably that part. So, because it goes into more detail. And even though, as I said, I haven't read it, I do want to, because I do look into I'm interested in all this. But one thing I will say that I like about this is that, like the other ones, it also inspired its share of stuff. It inspired music. Like, the Similarian has a whole album dedicated to it from Blind Guardian called Nightfall in Middle-earth, which is the first album of them I heard. It's a very good album. And I do like this first track, has a little conversation between Sauron and Morgoth, and I like the last part of it. I had a part in everything. Twice I destroyed the light and twice I failed. I left ruin behind me when I returned, but I also carried ruin with me. She, the mistress of her own lust. He doesn't say it that dramatically, but I think you get the point. And, in conclusion, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, excellent fantasy novels. Two of my favorite fantasy novels, very influential for me. Very influential for multiple people. And I can see why, and they are ripe for adaptating. Now, the one thing is, especially with this more so with Lord of the Rings, there is a lot of stuff you have to cut out from it, which I will get to some of that when I actually get to the movies. More so the live-action ones than the animated ones, but The Hobbit, you have to add some stuff, actually. Because I know with 2 movies they could do the whole thing. They're just adding some stuff to make it more connected with Lord of the Rings and go with some of the stuff that happened that was in the background of the books. But anyway, that concludes this video. Take care.